Our beautiful planet is under attack by diseases that are connected. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pandemics. But we've been treating these diseases in isolation, with insufficient resources and usually too late. EarthTeam explores solutions that can protect our planet and people in a more proactive, preventive, and holistic way. Join us as we explore this new planetary health approach.
Steve, good to see you. We're going to talk about how the legal trade in wildlife masks the illegal trade and how this endangers both wildlife and people. But to frame that, perhaps it would be really useful if you could start by defining what the wildlife trade is. Why is some of it legal and why is some of it illegal?
Well, that's a big question, but the wildlife trade, first of all, it's global. It's not just in some parts of the world. It is a multi-billion-dollar trade when we're talking about the whole trade in the hundreds of billions of dollars. They reckon the illegal trade is maybe around 20 billion, give or take 5 or 10, nobody really knows. And we're talking about, wild plants and animals, flora and fauna. So typically what we see is, consumer countries that want this going through transit countries and harvesting it. And a lot of it's being harvested supposedly legally, getting the papers to move it across borders. But in fact, what we're seeing are quotas being exceeded, enforcement officers not knowing what they're looking at, letting it pass. And so a huge illegal trade burgeoning under the guise of legal trade.
I think it's really important to emphasize the scale of this, that the legal trade globally is estimated at 220 billion or thereabouts. And just in terms of the numbers of animals as well, we think about China, we think about Vietnam, but in the US, 200 million live animals are imported every single year with essentially zero screening or oversight. That's a recipe for disaster, surely.
The United States used to be the biggest importer of wildlife in the world. Now it's probably number 2 next to China. And by their own admission, they probably only get to inspect about 5% of those imports.
That's pretty insane. Obviously, that poses a risk to wildlife populations, but there must be a massive public health risk with all this import as well.
For sure, this legal trade, it masks illegal trade, but it can mask viruses too. The experts recommend there's 800,000 viruses out there of the 1.6 million that could be passed on to people through animals. We saw what COVID-19 could do. So who knows what the next virus will be called, but it looks like that it could be much worse. And which animal is going to, spread it to us?
And surely putting yourself into the perspective of a police officer or a customs official, if there's this enormous legal trade happening, and then underneath that there's a illegal trade, often in the same species or in similar taxa, that's a lot to deal with if you're an already stressed customs official.
This is what I think is the biggest problem, if not, the second biggest problem in this whole equation is the lookalike problem, and also just the complexity of the wildlife regulations, CITES, national laws, all that. I've been to so many meetings and so many trainings with police officers from so many different countries, and they all say the same thing once they get to know you over a coffee or a beer, which is, it's too confusing to know what's legal and what's illegal. And it takes too much time to figure out if it's from this species or that species. Why don't you just ban it all and make our job easier? And that's exactly what we should do.
I'm a PhD biologist, and I don't think I would know the difference between lion bone and tiger bone, one of which is legal, one of which is illegal.
If you put a lion skeleton next to a tiger skeleton, it's virtually impossible to see which one is which if you remove the skull. And even then it's difficult. Experts can tell once you put the head there. And there's a little bit, something minorly different about the femur bone. Very difficult to tell the difference.
You've worked on some incredibly high profile cases where these traders have used the legal trade to mask their illegal trade. Perhaps most famously of all, the Hydra Gang and their remarkable, diverse, multiple ways of getting in uh, animals legally underneath the banner of their legal trade. Can you talk about that a little bit more in some more detail?
Sure. The Hydra gang, as you call it, they were global, based out of Southeast Asia, but had their network of people sourcing all these animals, body parts in different parts of the world, especially in Africa. And they just found out quickly two things. First, they were a bit like Pablo Escobar, who, when he was helping to move coke for the traffickers, that there was a lot of money to be made. So he moved in and controlled it himself. These guys did the same thing. They were professional smugglers. They were moving drugs, they were moving cars, people. And then when they got hired to move rhino horn and rosewood and stuff like that, they started looking at the profit margins and then decided to muscle in themselves. They also figured out, secondly, pretty quickly, that there is legal trade out there, and they don't have to smuggle this in the dead of the night. They can move it across borders in the light of day in trucks with certificates. Lion bones, lions can be legally killed, at least until pretty recently, and even now we're still seeing some of that happen. Rhino horn, there was an exclusion to allow rhinos to be hunted for, trophies. These are huge loopholes for crooks like this who know how to launder and trick people.
To actually pin something on them, though, that must take a lot of evidence building, a lot of time, a lot of informants. Can you talk through the process of how you went from knowing these guys were doing this to actually being able to try and stop them?
Well, embarrassingly, it took a long time, and we finally came to the conclusion. We had all kinds of intel on this syndicate, who was who in the zoo, how they were doing it, where they were doing it, etc. But the top guys and women were smart, that they never put their hands on the bank accounts. Their names were not attached to the money, if you will. So it was hard to pin them down. And then secondly, people were using wildlife law to go after these syndicate members. So they were getting slaps on the wrist. One guy got 40 years in prison. That eventually got reduced to 6.5, probably the biggest sentence we've seen for a while. So eventually we decided the best way to go after them was through their money and to link them to these accounts. So at the end of the day, it was anti-money laundering investigations that led, from these bloody trails of carcasses across Africa and parts of Asia to these hotels and properties and bank accounts in Southeast Asia and a couple other countries.
In terms of the carcasses and the body parts that you describe, was this gang brazen about that, or were they trying to hide it, or did they feel they didn't need to?
Pretty brazen, actually, to the point where one of them, who got arrested, he got out on bail, had to appear once a month. And we know for a fact, having seized his phones and computers later, that while he was out of court, but still, under arrest, he was trafficking. So the records show he was still doing it.
I find it astonishing how, to these people, wildlife is just another commodity. It could be tobacco, could be alcohol, could be drugs, guns, people. It's just a commodity. And in this case, because of the way the legal structure is set up, there seems to be just really low risk, really high reward to risk ratio for these guys.
Well, that was it. I think actually compared to the tobacco trafficking, the drug trafficking, and even to some degree the human trafficking that they might have been involved in, this is actually more attractive because the profit margins were as big and sometimes bigger, and the risk levels were much lower. Because if you get caught, so what? You spend, you maybe, $1,000 fine, up to 4 years in prison in some countries, if you ever, made it through the court system.
So one issue is clearly the fact that environmental crimes aren't prosecuted severely enough. But the other issue you've alluded to is the fact that most law enforcement officials just don't know what's a crime and what's not a crime. So what is the main argument used by people that want to maintain the legal trade in wildlife if it is proving such a nightmare for enforcement?
Well, we hear all the time still that we need to actually just legalize the trade, recognize that these are, 1,000-year-old traditions of consuming some of these body parts or animals for whatever reasons, plow the proceeds made from illegal trade back into conservation. So it's win-win. And actually, if you're if you don't care that much about the animals, that actually looks good on paper, makes sense economically. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. It's chaos. In reality, what we see is that the demand outstrips the supply provided by the legal channels, and anybody in this business is going to want to have their own supply chain. They're not going to want to go through some government legal stockpile. And if they can pay less to a poacher directly and convince that their consumer that, hey, this bear, this tiger, this rhino was really killed in the wild just last week. Here's a photo. They're going to get a better profit margin.
Well, we saw that explicitly with ivory after the 2009 legal sale, where Southern African countries were allowed to sell to Japan and China. We saw a massive spike in poaching, peaking in 2013 when we were losing about 30,000 elephants a year in the wild. So clearly, supply was never going to keep up with demand.
Yeah, I think every time governments, talk about legalizing the trade or maintaining a legal trade in whatever species, they're sending a signal to the black market that there is this huge opportunity to launder poached animals through. And that's what we saw with Hydra. That's what we've seen with the ivory trafficking that you just mentioned. So, it bothers me tremendously that this argument is still made. And if you listen closely or read the papers that these proponents of legal trade put out there, they're always coming back to, oh, it worked with crocodiles. It worked with vicuña. And I'm like, well, first of all, it didn't work with all crocodiles. In Southeast Asia, the legalization of crocodile trafficking led to all these croc farms. It's really hard to find a Siamese crocodile these days. It may have worked in a particular part of North America where there's strong enforcement regimes in place, but for most of the world, those are not in place. And so legalization of these species is really a prescription for disaster. You're putting, gasoline on the fire.
Can you see a need for illegal trade in any species? Like fish, presumably there has to be some kind of dispensation because traded internationally in terms of food. But for terrestrial wildlife, can you see a need for trade in any?
Well, first of all, on fish, I eat fish, although I'm trying to eat less now because for health reasons and other reasons. But, I would argue, yes, you need to have some kind of regime for sustainable, healthy stocks of fish. For terrestrial species, what I've seen, what I've read, and what I've seen with my own eyes is just numbers going down and down and down. And so I think we need to pause at least commercial trade in wild animals while we catch up with the fact that there's too much wildlife crime and we don't know which of these animals might spur the next outbreak.
I think it's easy to forget that we've just come out of a 2-year pandemic, which came from wildlife as zoonotic disease, and that most of the last pandemics we've also lived through were also zoonotic, and it's very likely that the next one we're going to live through will also be zoonotic. We haven't yet had a massive issue with bird flu, but global populations of seabird are plummeting, and that came out of duck farms in China. It does seem as though the legal trade in wildlife is potentially the biggest public health threat that we're facing as a species right now.
I totally agree. And I just came from Washington, D.C., where I had meetings with pandemic prevention experts and others. And I was a little concerned still that everybody's asking the question, what would stricter regulations on wildlife trade do to poor people? Nobody wants to be tough on poor people. Neither do I, but what we're talking about here when we talk about pausing or banning commercial trade on wild animals, we're not talking about banning subsistence hunting. We're talking about this out of control commercial trade, which involves all classes of people, and an outbreak, if and when it happens, and it's going to happen again, it always does, it's going to impact poor people more than anybody. And we have to remember the whole commercial trade in wildlife, it's driven by wealth. It's not driven by poverty.
Also, the one thing we can guarantee costs an enormous amount of money is trying to cure a pandemic, whereas prevention is so much cheaper and so much better in so many ways. The cost of COVID is currently estimated at somewhere in the region of 11, 12 trillion dollars, so some enormous sum. Whereas it seems to have been estimated that you could prevent the next pandemic by investing something in the region of 26 billion per year.
Less than 2%. If the way you do the numbers, it might even be less than 1% of the cost of that COVID. Basically, the bill that we picked up from that pandemic, less than 1% of that could actually prevent the next pandemic. In the big scheme of things, we're spending, huge amounts of money on protecting our borders, our national security, the wars that are going on right now. If we could just get the countries to get together on this and look at the one threat that is posed to all of us, which is pandemics. I think this is the new terror. And yet we seem to be here in 2024 thinking we've just vaccinated our way out of another outbreak. We can do it again.
What seems to be the case at the moment is that the default position by regulators is that trade is fine, and then you try and regulate the few little bits of trade that they're able to identify are problematic. Whereas what seems to be the case is that everything's problematic. So surely the default should be that trade is stopped, and then you allow those bits that are genuinely sustainable and not at risk. Right? How do you get through to the regulators that that's the way to do things?
This is the big elephant in the room. This is the convenient truth also, which is that we really have to stop trying to regulate this trade. We've been doing it for decades. We've been trying to do it for decades, and it's not working. So nobody wants to come in and say, which is why we're trying to say it at EarthTeam, hey, why not just pause the trade? Look at the tiny percentage of people in the world who actually benefit from it, a large percentage of which are crooks. Look at the huge threat that is posed to the whole planet, not just the animals, but the people. Why don't we stop it? And I would submit to you that one of the reasons we don't, there's two reasons that come to my mind. One is politicians and government officers don't want to be seen as being tough on poor people. But like I said before, it's not really poor people who are making money on this. And they're the ones that are going to get hit the hardest. And secondly, some of these politicians are involved in the trade themselves. We've seen that. What we need to see is a transition program. If you're going to spend billions and billions and billions of dollars on vaccine rollout, how about taking a smidgen of that and providing it to the legal traders and saying, hey, let's transition you into a new livelihood. You don't have to cut them off. Done it with other things, but drug substitution programs, et cetera. There's a precedent for this. Governments know how to do this, but there needs to be the will, and there needs to be the recognition that wildlife trade is not driven by poverty, it's driven by wealth.
We're seeing the same in the global energy transition as well. We need to move away from fossil fuels, and we're seeing what's called the just energy transition, where people are supported in that transition. We need to move away from wildlife trade, but people need to be supported as they transition away and into something that's more sustainable.
Well, you and I agree 100% on that.
Thanks, Steve. Great to chat as ever. It's a fascinating subject and one that needs a lot more attention.
Thanks. Thanks now.